So this is week 11, and we are doing Lila Quintero Weaver's Darkroom, a memoir in black and white. And I'm grateful, as usual, to have her actually here with me to talk about this. So thank you for being here.
Absolutely. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me and for teaching my book in your course.
Well, I was going to say there was actually somebody here. I got here about 3 years ago to Piedmont, and there was a history teacher. I had a student in my class, and she said a history teacher is using graphic novels, and he's actually the one who introduced me to it because I'd never heard of it. This is about 3 years ago. So then I picked it up and read it, and the initial time I read it, what really kind of struck me was the intersections and the social constructions of whiteness that you talk about with your family being Argentinian, right? And immigrating to the US.
Mm-hmm.
And then this time around, I was picking up on other things because, of course, as time progresses, you start to pick up on other things. But it's an excellent book that gives us further insight into the civil rights movement, but also, as Santos points out in his chapter, dispels that binary that we have, which a lot of the books that we're doing this semester do, of just a black and white, discussions of race or America, right?
Yes.
And I'm thankful for that. Can you talk about the book a little bit, or kind of what led you to write the book? Because it was actually a project as you were graduating, right?
That's right. So I dropped out of college when I was the traditional college age and went on with life. But it always bugged me. It felt like this unfinished business that I had to address. So when I went back to school, I took advantage of a program that many universities, I think, have programs like this. The University of Alabama has one. It was then called External Degree Program. They have another name for it now. And basically, it's designed for adults who are past the traditional college age, who are in their careers, involved with a family, don't have time or whatever to go on campus that much. So I finished my degree by that route with that program. One of the requirements of that program is to do a 15 credit hour senior project. So I'm a big planner. And the minute that I knew that this existed, I started thinking, what in the world could I do? So at first I thought, okay, I think I would like to do something about immigration. So I started digging into immigration issues in the US, the current and the history, many other things related to that. And I saw that, oh, good grief, this would be an encyclopedia. This is ridiculous. So I honed it down to my family's personal experience with immigration. And I was planning to write a traditional text only. But then I remembered that about a year previous to that, I had seen in the book review section of the New York Times this book that was recently released in English translation, and it's Persepolis, a memoir by an Iranian woman who writes about her childhood in Iran during the
revolution.
The revolution, and shortly before, right before that, the 8-year war with Iraq. And it was just many explosive things that happened, fully illustrated story, personal story. And when you open the pages just casually, you'd think you're looking at a children's book. And yet she is dealing with these really dark episodes of family history when members of her family are taken into custody and interrogated by the authorities. And it also has lighthearted moments, funny things. So I remembered hearing about that book, and I thought, well, hang on a second. I'm an artist. That's what I, have done most of my adult life. I could do an illustrated depiction of my family's immigration story. So that's how it came about. So I took a photo album, 40 pages long, and that inspired me. I thought, okay, this is, I just didn't know another way, satellite, to bind it. So I just took something that was already bound to put my pictures in, and that inspired me to do it as if it were an actual photo album. So I did my drawings as if they were photographs. And I put them in with those little corner mounts,
Yep.
that you can make a nice little neat presentation. And then I made captions as if they were captions in a family photo album. So, so that's how it came about. And that was the beginning of, never had even a glimmer of thought that this would be something anyone would want to publish.
Well, but my question is, so was Persepolis kind of your introduction to graphic memoirs or graphic novels?
Yes, it was.
And I find that really interesting because as you mentioned, you did this kind of as a photo album, and I see it, but it is still very much in line with comics. And Santos talks about it as a graphic novel, which it is, right?
Yes.
Because you have sequences, you have the gutters, you have the frames, all these types of things that are there. And one of the things that I'll admit this, the first time I read it, I was kind of turned off by the photorealism. So I was like, I love the story, but the photorealism I was a little put back against. But reading it this time, I think I appreciated a lot more. And a lot of what you do, because you're going through a lot of different things. I think a lot of important things for this moment, because one of the things that caught me this time is that prologue, where you open up and you're actually talking about watching the films backwards, right?
Yes.
And there's the moment where you're talking about the men and women and children marching from the church to the courthouse. And then on page 6, always sees their feet, but you have this line right here. It was funny. How could anybody know where, and this is them walking backwards from the courthouse to the church. How could anybody know where they were going without ever looking back? And as I read through this with all the discussions going on right now that are not new, I kept thinking about that and thinking about you finding your sister's books, which I'm going to talk about in a second too. But can you talk about kind of the importance of why we need this story? Because students are going to see this story, that the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson, again when they read March, because it's in there. And like you said, it sparked the Selma to Montgomery marches, right? So can you talk about just that question? How could anybody know where they are going without ever looking back, and how your book, how your life story and memoir fits into that?
So I think that perhaps the reasons why my publisher even wanted to publish this book kind of give me a hint, sort of like looking from someone else's point of view to say, why would someone even want to pick up my book, is that my publisher, the University of Alabama Press, and many other university presses throughout the South have huge catalog full of titles about the civil rights movement, about racism in the South, but very little from the point of view of an outsider, someone coming in as an immigrant, someone witnessing what is happening without having had this backlog, this sort of many decades of history that go in to make this thing called Southern culture, that is this mix of Black Americans and white Americans, and how they come together in this geographical area, a shared history and yet a deeply confrontational history of oppression and so on. So on from that point, that the fact that that I come in as a child with sort of the implied innocence, and also as an outsider. So I have friends of mine who are in my generation, or maybe a little bit older, who remember Jim Crow very well. I'm talking about white people who live in Alabama. They have told me that it was, they were blind to it. For the most part, this is just how it is. This is how it is, that my mother has this Black woman who works for the family that she gives a ride back to her house, and she pays her like an abysmal, you know,
Right.
pennies on the hour kind of wage that this woman cannot sit with a family and eat. She, with a white family, she has to have her own bathroom, all these sorts of things that were just clear as day markers of discrimination and racial oppression that they did not see. So
Can you talk about that a little bit? Because there's moments in here where you mention that. You mentioned at one point too, and I was looking, you're swinging, right? And then there's the, I don't remember what happens, but you're on the swing and you're oblivious to what's going on. You
yeah.
talk about after Jackson's murder, y'all walking to school and not noticing, you know, except for maybe glass here or there, right? Can you kind of talk about that? And I would say it's blindness, because you bring that up too when you're talking about getting your glasses and being able to see and distinguish faces, right? And
Yes.
distinguish differences within individuals. And one thing that I really like about Santos is he points that out too, because I kept thinking about those. Everything is kind of two-dimensional, but just the really simplistic, and they're not simplistic, but you know what I mean, compared to the rest, sketches of individuals that are just black and white, right?
Yeah.
And I like the way that Santos says that that's kind of, you know, looking the shallowness of looking at race and differences. And even when you're putting the glasses on, but can you kind of talk about that blindness a little bit? Because this is something we've talked about a little bit with other books that we've read, like Jerry Craft's New Kid. And Jonathan Flowers brought me to ontological expansiveness, which is basically that everything works for you as a white person, right? And nothing else, you know, kind of matters. You're oblivious to everything else. So why is it important for us to not be blind to these issues?
All right, exactly. Yes. And so I felt like it was important to admit to my readers that I too had racial blindness, that as a child, because I grew up seeing certain kinds of faces, that when I was for the first time exposed to a mixed racial picture. So I think, you know, at some point I point out that Argentina was a place where you would never see a black person, period, never. So that what happens is that lack of exposure, that in our brains, we don't learn to see the individuality of a face. So obviously I hammered a lot on this with my interest in drawing people's faces and how learning to observe and learning to have my eyes open and to see that your nose is a particular way. It's not like a white nose or an Asian nose or whatever. It's a nose. It's a human nose. The same way with a person of any race. So that kind of blindness, and I do recall a certain moment in my childhood when I must have been 6 maybe, and walking down the streets of tiny downtown Marion, Alabama, and seeing a lot of Black people coming. It was very popular on a Saturday morning. That was the shopping day. And seeing a lot of Black people and realizing that they did kind of blend together for me. I did not understand. I did not have yet the neurons, you know, connecting in such a way for me to be able to see. So it wasn't about my eyes. It wasn't about my vision. It was actually about what's behind the eyes, the ability to see faces.
There's a few things you mentioned there that I keep thinking about. And the first thing that you mentioned was admitting to your readers. And I think that that's something that graphic memoirs do well, or memoirs in general, because they're showing a vulnerableness to the reader, saying that this is what I experienced. And you see you working through it as a kid, right? And then of course, and then you see you kind of progressing as you're going through, you know, your education and learning. The other thing that kind of stands out to me too, that I think is important, is that you mentioned being in Argentina, but you also draw the connections between the class and ethnic distinctions in Argentina and here, which I think is important. But you point out not seeing anybody who's Black, right? Which reminds me of James Baldwin's Stranger in the Village, where he's in Switzerland and he's the only Black person there, and the way they kind of, come up to him and treat him as exotic, basically. And he
Exactly.
talks about being there in Switzerland, in that town in Switzerland, but also the village, but then compares that to the US too. It's a really important essay. But can you talk a little bit about how you made the connections between social structures in Argentina when you started learning the social structures in Alabama?
So what's interesting is that because I did not go back to Argentina for so many decades, it was an economic reason for this. My mother would go when her parents were still alive. She would go, and it, for us as a family of limited economic means, it felt like a huge sacrifice for her to go. And then later, my father went a few times. When I finally went and got to see for myself something that looked hideously racist to me, that I knew it was, and I saw that my own cousins who live there, some of them seemed completely blind to it. When I brought out something about these particular neighborhoods, working class neighborhoods in Buenos Aires, where there's a huge clustering of recent immigrants from Bolivia and, pardon me, and Paraguay primarily. And there are certain racial epithets that these people, are targeted with. And so I was talking at a dinner table one night, and I was, saying some things about that. And I got some blowback from some other people there who said, now, wait a minute. No, we are not racist. You don't see us. We don't hit them. We don't kick them. He was talking in terms of rate of physical violence. That was his standard for how you measure racism. And I was livid. I thought, oh, well, that's the end point. That's the end point. You're going to go through a lot of other phases before you get to the physical violence. You need to stop this in the bud before you get there. Like, for example, let's stop calling them names. Let's stop treating them like they are dogs instead of humans.
And there's a few things there too that connect with things that we've been doing. And one of the things I've kind of noticed, and you point this out when you're saying that, I don't remember who told me this or where this came from, but the fact that we kind of look elsewhere and say that they're being racist without looking at our own self. Yeah. And it's really easy, like I said, we've done Mouse, it's really easy to look at Nazi Germany and say they were racist and anti-Semitic and xenophobic, and here's the proof, right? And a lot of the individuals during that period, even afterwards, were saying that we have our own issues here in the US, but we're not looking here, right? Lillian Smith basically says nowhere was the hatred for the Nazis more vehement than the US South, basically. And it's partly because their conscience hurt is kind of her argument, right? And she's from Georgia.
Yeah.
So it's easy to point out those differences somewhere else without looking at yourself too. And then the other thing that you mentioned too is that there are phases to this, which is what Mouse kind of shows, that there are phases to this increased violence that occurs. It starts with words and name calling, then it goes to segregation, then it goes to something else, right? So I think that's really important for kind of students to point out too. And that leads me to another question, because you mentioned your blindness, but you also talk about in the book the way that education worked. And there's two facets to this. One is, of course, what you learned in school, which we need to talk about, but then also what you learned from your sister's books. Because the books that you depict in there, The Second Sex from de Beauvoir, Griffin's Black Like Me, Native Son from Richard Wright. I don't remember who wrote the Mengele book, but you have a panel where you show yourself sitting in bed, reading the Mengele book, as what I assume, because everything behind it is dealing with the Holocaust, the Gestapo, Zyklon B, all this stuff. And then the book is kind of illuminating your face, right? So can you kind of talk about, I guess, Jenny's books or the importance of having books like that and works like that at home? And then we
Yeah.
can get into what you learned at school too.
Right. I cannot think of any other way other than those books that I would have been exposed to photographs of cadavers in Auschwitz and in other camps when I, as a child.
And this was the 60s, right?
Yes,
So not even a little bit over 20 years after the war.
exactly. Right. Yes. My husband and I sometimes talk about, remember the days when somebody's father, a classmate's father, was a veteran of World War II, and he was like a 42-year-old guy. You know, it felt so fresh to us, even though we were born after the war. It still felt recent, and just that same sort of horror that I feel about having been a witness to Jim Crow, that I still can't believe. I still can't believe I saw these things. In that same way, I still can't believe that my oldest sister, was born in 1945 when these camps in Europe were basically being liberated, when people, these still walking cadavers, you could say, were being rescued from those conditions. That's how recent it was for me.
Well, did you learn about it in school, or did you learn about it through the book? So that's kind of my other discussion too, is what did you even talk about? Because like I said, it was fresher. What did you learn about the war in school, if anything, at that point?
Not very much. Learned a lot of sort of like sweeping, very, very generalized descriptions of frankly how, the US came in basically to save the day. And so I want to frame, when I'm talk about American exceptionalism, which I don't really address that much in Darkroom, I feel sort of like I need to frame it in that in the actual reality of the fact that the US coming into into military action, that really did have an immense impact on the war turning. So I don't, I'm grateful that's the way it went down, so that we're not all living under Nazi regimes forever after. But let's see. Okay, remind me what exactly, where will we be going? I got a little bit lost.
Well, I was just asking about, what you actually learned in school, because I mean, some of the things we're doing here is we're looking at Japanese incarceration for one, which is one of the things that, of course, we did wrong. And we haven't looked at it much, but I've told them about the ways that the Nazis took their laws from Jim Crow, some of them, kind of the support for the Nazis in the US, and all these connections that are there that we kind of look over. And that discussion of American exceptionalism, I think, is important, because what does that kind of do? That's kind of what the No Alabama book is too, right? It's Southern exceptionalism, which we get to. And what's kind of the harm of just saying that it's exceptional and not saying that things are actually wrong, and actually reckoning with it? Because Germany's reckoned a lot more than we have with their recent past compared to what we've kind of, reckoned with.
Yes. There is a marked difference. And I'm very, very interested in how Germany has dealt and continues to deal with their past. In fact, there is a graphic novel you may be familiar with. I've got it right here because I thought, oh, maybe this might come up.
I haven't seen that one.
Okay, it is outstanding. So it is written by a German woman who lives in the US. Her name is Nora Krug, Krug, and Belonging, A German Reckons with History in Home. So her style is, her artistic style is very interesting. Just give you and
that looks like the Three Escapes of Hannah Arendt a little bit.
I'm not familiar with that. That's interesting. But she also uses photos of a lot of documents that she dug through. She was trying to discover, what did my grandparents do
Right.
during that period? To what degree were they complicit? Were they complicit at all? Were they members of the party? If they were, why did they join? Things like that, that she is dealing with what feels like this vague sense of guilt that hangs over, according to her, and she's under 50 years old, I would say, that having grown up in Germany, that she was accustomed to this sort of like cloud of shame of being German and what we did. So it's interesting to me that we don't have that white Southerners don't have any, I don't see anything like that.
Well, you mentioned that phrase cloud of shame, which I think is a really telling phrase, because when I think about these issues and are coming to terms with them and reckoning with them, I don't know if it'd be a cloud of shame, but there is a shame, and there is a maybe victimhood is the better word. There's this cloud of victimhood, I think, over the South, because the South is the reciprocal of the nation's sins. And I think that's part of it, is that the North is just as complicit as the South in different ways. And numerous people point that out, because economically they were, surviving off of enslavement. And even after even during Jim Crow, they're, benefiting from these economic things. So I think it's this cloud of victimhood, which leads us to kind of that lost cause narrative of the No Alabama textbook. And you have a chapter about that. Can you talk about kind of that type of text? I'm assuming that was a United Daughters of the Confederacy approved textbook.
No doubt. And I mean, I don't have any documentation about that, but it went right along the lines of what I remember as a, say, 7th grader, these essay contests sponsored by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Yes, if you grew up in the South at a certain period, then you might remember those. So, right, the idea was to sort of
extol the virtues of the South and the lost South.
The glory of this lost cause and the old, beautiful old South. So I did an article one time when I was doing, some journalism, and I did an article about this historical theater in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, called Bama Theater. And it has, like, the beautiful interior with a ceiling that looks like a sky with little pinpoints of light looking like stars, all of that sort of thing. So the big grand opening of the movie Gone with the Wind, I interviewed people.
So 1939.
Yes, I interviewed people. So the theater, I think, opened in 1937, something like that. And it was a works project.
WPA thing.
Yes. And anyway, so people that I interviewed who were, say, teenagers then, they talked about, like, the lines that were wrapped around the block to get in to see that movie, that it was a huge, huge thing. So, okay, but
that just a quick side note too, that gets into something that we've talked about within this class too, is media representation and the power of media representation and the impacts it has. And Gone with the Moon was huge. And the NAACP, Walter White and others are like, this could be a real problem because of the way that motion pictures impact individuals, right? And Birth of a Nation was the same thing. I mean, Woodrow Wilson showed it in the White House in 1915. But it made me think of this too. I recently interviewed somebody for the Lillian Smith podcast. And this was a woman, a professor who was a Fulbrighter in Romania. And we talked to one of her students too. And she taught Lillian Smith and Southern Lit there. And the student says that his impression of the South before that class was Gone with the Wind.
Yeah.
Right. So the impact of that film in particular and of this narrative not just here, but also elsewhere, I think is important to show that it's not just a regionalized, localized thing. It expands outward.
Yes, yes, it's, I would say, international,
Right.
because for a lot of people of a certain generation, Gone with the Wind was
Right.
a,
And this kid's maybe 20, and he was like, that was my idea of the South. With
right.
with the paternalistic, with the mammy, with everything's fine,
Mhm.
that we're being victimized, all of that type of
And
stuff.
interestingly enough, this is a sidebar that when in Argentina, when I during my last visit there, when you present a credit card, you have to also present a photo ID.
Mhm.
And so people would look at my Alabama driver's license and they would say, Alabama, and they would say, oh, Forrest Gump. So that cultural idea about Alabama maybe is moving away from Gone with the Wind. I don't know. But so our point here, actually, to go back to your question about being taught about the Old South. So my discovery of my rediscovery of this textbook, No Alabama, that I had in the 4th grade, came sometime in the late 1980s or early 1990s, when I was in the children's section of the library with one of my kids. And I wandered over to where they have the reference, the books that you cannot check out.
Yeah.
And I saw the spine of that book and I said, holy moly, let's see if this is my old textbook. And I looked at it. So looking at it again after so many decades and seeing how shocking it was to see the narrative presented with such bald face adulation for this, this was our way of life. Isn't it wonderful that you could have been, imagine yourself being a little boy living on this plantation and your father's the master,
Right.
and you go out on a horse to, see the slaves working in the fields, all of that. It was renewed for me. The shock of it was renewed. So I forgot all about it again until I started working on Darkroom, which would have been yet another couple of decades later. And I thought, oh, please let that book still be there. So I went and found it and I photocopied pages to be able to get the exact wording and to be able to think about now, how would I insert my own illustrations here and help people to understand how I, as a 4th grader in 1965 or 66, would have been taught about this period of history.
Well, I mean, even the section on Reconstruction, right?
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
I just started diving into kind of the history of racial violence in my hometown or my home area of Northwest Louisiana. And the Bossier massacre, 128, maybe 160 people were murdered, right? And the language about, and that was during Reconstruction in 1868. The language about Reconstruction on Bossier Parish's website is like straight this, that there were individuals looking to upend our way of life, basically, right?
Yes, right.
So it's really important. And one thing for my students to know too is that the second Klan, the cross burning started with Birth of a Nation. The first Klan didn't do that, but the second Klan originated in Georgia on Stone Mountain.
Yes, it's all around us. And so earlier we were talking about how Germans have or continue to deal with their extremely troubled history. And what is it culturally? What is it about the US or about the American South that there would continue to be a resistance? And that even today that we have laws that are being enacted in state after state about these are things you cannot talk about in the classroom. You cannot address, these certain code words that cannot be used.
Right. How under some of these laws, and I would back up and say the nation, as you started off saying, I wouldn't just say the South. even though I totally agree with what you're saying. I mean, but how could I talk about Japanese incarceration in a P12 class, right? How could I talk about what happened during Reconstruction? How could I talk about what happened at Hiroshima, right? I mean, you can view our bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki not as our winning in the war, but as a war crime.
Yeah.
You know, those are important discussions for students to have. And it leads me, there's a couple more questions I have for you, but it leads me to page 196 in your book. When you're talking about Krug and her kind of looking into her family history, but you're looking at the picture in the magazine, right? In the national magazine, about looking at the clan family and determining, who is who, like who is it, right? I don't really know a question I have for this, but can you just kind of talk about that page? And yeah.
Right. So that would have been probably like a Life magazine or Look magazine.
Right.
One of those. I kind of get them confused, but I remember that my parents would get a number of national magazines like that, and that there was a photo, and I tried to find it in some kind of, search, some kind of archive, and I was not able to. But the shock that people who wear these hoods that I had always seen with their faces completely covered and just the little eye holes, that seeing that revealed that it was what I would call normal looking people that were everywhere I looked, in my neighborhood, in my school, in my church. These were the people that I saw.
So this is South Carolina in 1965 in Beaufort.
Yeah.
So a mother with a baby, right? And this is actually a review of I'm teaching this book right now, which I'm thinking a lot when you're talking is McCrae's Mothers of Massive Resistance, White Women in the Politics of White Supremacy. But I think of that, but I think I've shared this with students before. I think of this picture too. And this is from Gainesville, Georgia in 1992.
Oh my goodness. Look at that. And see, that child does not even know what she is wearing. She does not.
And that one doesn't either.
Yeah. Right.
And I think that's kind of, there's two things going on there. One is that they don't know what they're wearing until they get older. And then if they're inculcated in it, do they turn away from it or lean into it? But the other thing too is the fact that you're saying these are ordinary individuals.
Yeah.
Like these are, it reminds me of Nazi Germany. They're ordinary individuals who are doing it, right? And a different kind of thing. And there's arguments that the first fascist kind of, organization was the Klan, which tracks with me, makes sense. So it's really kind of an interesting, or not interesting, but it's really kind of an important thing to think about. I would say, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. So a journalist from Birmingham, Alabama, who won a Pulitzer Prize for her book, Carry Me Home, Diane McWhorter. Her family was part of sort of like the elite of Birmingham, and the country club set, all of that. So this was the era when she was a child. That was the era of the White Citizens Council. Right. And so these were the professionals in white society, the doctors, the lawyers, the ministers, everyone, the respectable set. But there was dirty work to be done, and they were not going to get their hands dirty. So she makes it crystal clear how there was this willingness to just sort of take care of this problem. Don't tell me how you did it.
Right. I mean,
I don't want to know about it. Just take care of it.
I mean, the UDC is part of that apparatus, right? And they just read Ernest Gaines's Of Loving Dust. That's what Bonbon is. That's what Cajuns are in Gaines's work, is that they do the dirty work for the wealthy white landowners. And that dirty work involves terrorizing and abusing and violently attacking Blacks.
Yeah. if you ever get a chance, and I'd highly recommend it, going to the two new museums in Montgomery, Alabama, and the one that is like an open monument to victims of lynching. It is really a deeply emotional experience.
I was able to take my students before I left Auburn to it because it just opened.
Okay.
So the Equal Justice Initiatives memorial to lynching, the victims of lynching, also the museum from slavery to mass incarceration, I think is the full title of it. But I'm hoping to take students from here there too, because it is a powerful and important site.
It is. And if you, so
and it's, and well, I'm about to say the other thing too about, and I think I've talked about this in one of the other lectures, the other thing about Montgomery and elsewhere that's important too is it's right down the street from the White House and the Confederacy, which is still there. Right. And the one example I always give is Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where King preached. Yeah, he's on one corner. The State House is on the same street, and right across the street from Dexter Avenue, where you have a plaque recognizing King, you have a United Daughters of the Confederacy monument saying this is the path that Jefferson Davis took on his inaugural. Right. Right. So it's these juxtapositions of history and narrative that are butting up against each other. And going back to Germany, there's nothing like that in Germany for Hitler or Himmler or Goebbels or anybody, right? Right. All of that. The sites of violence, the ghetto, the concentration camps, they exist as memorials and as reminders of what happened, but there's not monuments saying this is the spot where, you know, Hitler did this or something, right? Or there's not a monument to him. There's an ongoing series in this online statewide newspaper called al.com. And so they have a series called State of Denial. And it is dedicated to this whole sort of centuries long or decades long structure that exists across institutions, basically to prop up the narrative of the Old South, of the innocence of institutions. And one article is wholly devoted to the archives, the historical archives in the state of Alabama, and sort of their founding person who was a member of the Bankhead. I think I've heard a little bit about that. Yeah. So anyway, so it's interesting, just the idea of the state of denial, of continuing to say, don't talk to us about this. We don't want to hear this. And so about the monuments of the lynching victims, when I stopped to read the plaques, many of these men, especially who were lynched, or Black men trying to vote. That was a capital crime in the eyes of the white establishment at that time. Was, oh, you tried to vote, you tried to exert your rights as a citizen, you tried to make yourself equal with us, you deserve death for this. So I don't know if I've shown students this, but I think we've talked about this, but this is an important kind of piece, is We Charge Genocide. This was, I forgot what group it was. This is, Patterson is one of the authors, but there was a civil rights group who did it. We Charge Genocide, the crime of government against the Negro people. This is 1951. This is what a group brought to the UN, charging that the US was committing genocide against African Americans based on their definition of genocide after, excuse me, based on their definition of genocide after the Holocaust. And what they do, there is a copy online. I can't find it right now, but there's a copy you can read. I'm gonna have to search around for it. I'll find a link. But they talk about and lay out how what's happening fits that definition, but they also give examples of individuals who were killed, violently attacked, whatever, between about 1945 and when it was published or presented in 51. And a lot of them are former soldiers coming back attempting to vote. That's so telling. And so the fact that we only recently had a passage of a law addressing lynching. And there have been attempts for that for over a century.
So why is that? Because there is no elected official, to my knowledge, who would advocate for lynching. It's not that. Is you don't want to advocate for talking openly, for acknowledging openly this hideous thing that happened. It's, it's just one of many things that basically we don't want to talk about that. I had a shocking experience. I was with a group of people in an Episcopal church, and the subject came up about the Japanese internment camps. And I said, I never heard a whisper of that all through my formal education. I found out that such a thing existed when I was an adult, and I don't remember my first exposure. So there was this man who was in his 90s who was there, sitting there in that group. And he said, oh, we had to do that because we were so afraid. We were so afraid of like the enemy from within.
The fifth column.
Yes. And I thought, wow, he is still basically defending that position of this is what we had to do to keep America safe. Even in the year 2010 or whenever this conversation took place.
I mean, the discussion, there's two things here, because I mean, the rise of violence against AAPI individuals, especially after 2020 with COVID. But fear is a powerful thing. And that's what happened in Nazi Germany, is they created this, rhetoric of fear around Jews or others, right? That's the same thing that happens here. The rhetoric of fear in the South with African Americans, the rhetoric of fear that a Black man's gonna rape a white woman, right?
Right.
That's the rhetoric of fear that's going on. So fear is powerful. And that's really interesting that he's like, well, we still have to do it because of fear. It's one thing. I mean, that's the Muslim ban, right? That's all of these kind of things.
Yeah. And so, when I was, so I wrote a children's book, and, so for a while I was kind of involved in sort of those conversations about children's literature. And it was interesting just to contemplate from this standpoint of what can you say in a kid's book, that children have to be, to a certain measure, guarded. You don't want to blast them with something. You don't want them looking at books about what Mengele did, how he made lampshades out of, I completely agree. That's not something you purposefully want to expose a child.
But how do you relay that information, that atrocity, to them at an age appropriate level for them is the question, right?
Right. On the other side of it, then how do you, so we don't want to terrorize children with information that they are not mature enough to handle. But a lot of this current conversation that's going on about what can be taught and what cannot be taught, the standard is not don't terrorize children. It is don't make them uncomfortable.
Right.
Don't make them
feel, a whole different thing.
Wow. What about the Black children that have sat in classrooms for eons and have been just a little bit more than uncomfortable about what was being presented?
I think about a lot of the walls, but the Don't Say Gay one in Florida.
Right.
And kind of one of the things with that is that you cannot teach anything about sex or anything K through 3. And I'm like, you can. Just how do you do it? But then also the other part of that is you can't teach anything. What was it? What was the phrasing? It's actually in the New Georgia law too, and I have it right here. What is it? Oh, here it is. You can't encourage classroom discussion of sexual orientation or gender identity in primary grade levels, or in a manner that is not appropriate for the age and developmental stage of the student. Yes, you have to do it for, the developmental age, and you have to do it for that age, but they're basically just saying you can't talk about it. Right. So, but let's end on this. There's a lot more to talk about. And I do want to talk about the slipperiness of whiteness, and I'm going to save that and post actually the piece that I wrote for them, because I kind of want to go in a different direction. One thing that I think is important for students and readers to realize when we think about the civil rights movement, and I think I don't think Santos talks about this explicitly, but we think about the images in black and white. And thinking, and your book is in black and white shades of gray, right?
Yes.
And March is the same thing. When we think about it in that context, we think about it as being distant from us. And this is your experience. You were 6. I mean, in the 60s, right?
Yes.
You were in high school and junior high in the late 60s, early 70s. It's not that far distant.
Right.
So I guess maybe part of the question is, why did you choose to do it in black and white? And then kind of, why do we need to remember that this is not a long gone past, and neither is World War II. There are people who were born during World War II or in the 30s who are still alive.
Right. That's true. That's true. So the reason it's in black and white, first of all, as a very practical matter, that my publisher said it would be absolutely out of the question. It would just
for a university press.
Yes, to have a full color book, because I thought, I was so naive that I thought, oh, this would be great to do this in color. And then when it was right from the get-go, I knew that it wasn't going to happen. So I thought, okay, actually, I can use this to my advantage, because what am I addressing here? So with many people, normally at university presses, my editor explained this to me. He said, usually we get a fully developed manuscript, that there's some editing to be done, of course, but people don't come with basically the germ of an idea. And then the press say, okay, sure, we'll publish this. So I was just unbelievably lucky to be able to get an editor. His name is Dan Waterman, and he was fabulous, to be able to see the potential and to say, all I'm looking at is this senior project that you did. Boy, how would you feel about publishing this? And I said, well, there's more to it. So anyway, so he worked with me to develop a full book with what began as almost nothing. So, right. So just the fact that I was limited to black and white made me look for ways to incorporate the black and white photograph as an important artifact, an important motif, for the fact that that's what my father worked in. He did not work in color photography. It was extremely expensive to develop color photos at that time. So that's what he was limited. I was limited to black and white in the book, and he was limited to black and white in his photography. Also newspapers. I talk a lot about newspapers as an important delivery of news.
And one quick side note is actually pay attention to the newspaper headlines throughout the book too.
Thank you for that. So I just began to see the connections. I thought, okay, there's this connection, and then there's this larger theme of black and white, as you say, this binary definition of this is race. This is the only racial sort of categorization that was even recognized. So that's how it came to be, subtitle Memoir in Black and White.
So how do you think it would change our reception if it was in color? And it is very cost prohibitive. I know that.
Yeah, that's interesting. So maybe something of that would be of what I was just referring to, that might be kind of obscured somewhat, of saying that this black and white world, the world was not black and white in the 1960s, but that's how media was. And that's how the definitions in the South of race were for us. You were either white or you were Negro.
And you have that point in there where you're checking the boxes and you're like, I don't feel white. And we didn't even get to this, but another important thing to think about with your book too is those American standards of beauty. As you talk about from your sister looking, or you looking at the magazines too in Argentina, and then being like, I didn't see any Black people in those until I got here, for one.
Right.
That's not to say if there weren't African American magazines and depictions, but the ones that
Right.
you're looking at, right? But then also the standards of beauty, the blonde hair. I think maybe your sister, you, the discussion of the lips, the nose,
Mhm.
those types of things are very important. So there's a lot more within this book that needs to be talked about, but we don't have time to talk about right now. So
Of course.
I
Yes.
thank you for joining us today.
And I thank you for inviting me, and thank you for what you're doing to help the field of education remember that all of these things need to be incorporated into the classroom.
Yeah.